Imagine being the personal driver of one of the most powerful men in the world and slowly starting to realize that he might not be human. Strange sounds, impossible movements, an aversion to sunlight, and even bizarre eating habits. These are just some of the evidence this former driver brings to support his claim. Mark Zuckerberg may be a reptilian. In this video, you will discover disturbing details and testimonies that have never been made public before. Is there something Mark Zuckerberg is trying to hide? The truth can be scarier than any conspiracy theory. Don't miss any details. If you like impactful content like this, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Let's explore together the stories that few have the courage to tell. The account of Mark Zuckerberg's former private driver begins as follows. Hello, my name is Jack Mitchell, and I worked as Mark Zuckerberg's private driver for 4 years between 2016 and 2020. It may seem like just another fancy job to outsiders, but being in that position was a completely life-changing experience, my perception of the world and of course of who Mark Zuckerberg really is. Let me explain how it all started. I was a professional driver in San Francisco, specializing in serving executives and important figures in Silicon Valley. After years of driving for high-profile entrepreneurs, I received an offer that seemed like the pinnacle of my career, working directly for the man who created Facebook. It was through a private security agency that they recommended me for the position. They don't hire just anyone, you know. You go through several interviews, confidentiality tests, and training to deal with extreme situations. At first, I was excited. I mean, who wouldn't be? Working with one of the most powerful men in the world seemed incredible. Mark has always been known for being secretive, almost mysterious, and I thought I would get a glimpse into the life of someone who shaped the digital age. But the truth is that what I saw and experienced alongside him left me with more questions than answers, questions that still haunt me to this day. I want to make it clear that I am not here to tarnish anyone's reputation. I'm here to tell you what I saw with my own eyes. During the 4 years I worked for Mark, I was in places few people even know exist. I took him to secret meetings, exclusive events, and even trips that never appeared in the media. I spent so many hours in the car with him that I began to notice details that no one else would see. Mark wasn't just reserved. He had habits, quirks, and behaviors that, over time, began to seem strange. At first, I thought it was just part of his personality. After all, we all have our quirks, right? But what I witnessed was like nothing I had ever seen before from anyone else, especially in the corporate world. You need to understand that when you work so closely with someone, masks inevitably fall. No matter how powerful or controlled you are, moments of vulnerability happen. It was in these moments that Mark made me uneasy. He was almost inhuman, I mean literally. There were times when he did things that I couldn't explain logically, things I just couldn't ignore. It wasn't an easy decision to tell this. I know what's at stake. He's a man with unlimited resources, and I'm just a former driver. But I feel like people have the right to know what really goes on behind the scenes in the life of this man who, in some ways, controls so much of our digital lives. And I'm not here to convince anyone, but to share my experience and let you draw your own conclusions. One of the first things that really made me question who or what Mark Zuckerberg was the peculiar way his eyes behaved. It seems like a small thing, I know, but when you spend so much time around someone, the details start to stand out, and with Mark, those details were impossible to ignore. I'm going to share an episode that I will never forget. It was a typical morning in Palo Alto, and I was taking Mark to an important meeting. While he was sitting in the back seat reviewing some documents on his tablet, I looked in the rearview mirror as I always did. Only this time, his eyes were different. They seemed to reflect light in an abnormal way. It wasn't like the common sparkle in someone's eyes under the sun or car lights. It was something more intense, almost as if his eyes were made of glass or some material that captured light in a completely non-human way. I remember thinking it must be a trick of the light. But then it happened again, this time in a place where the light was minimal. We were in the underground parking lot of a building, and he was answering something on his phone. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw it again, that glow, like there was an inner layer in his eyes. And it was even stranger because it seemed like his pupils were contracting and dilated in a way that didn't make sense. Not like a human's eyes, but like something reptilian. Yes, like the eyes of a reptile. But it wasn't just the brightness that caught attention. I started to notice that when Mark was angry or very focused, his eyes seemed to change shape, even if for fractions of a second. The pupils would become elongated like a lizard's and return to normal so quickly that you could easily doubt what you saw. At first, I thought it was tiredness or an effect of always looking at screens. But over time, it became clear that it was something more than that. There was a time when this happened in front of other people. It was a meeting with some executives in the car, and as I was driving them to an event, one of the men was explaining something that seemed to irritate Mark. When he answered, I could see in the rearview mirror that his eyes had that same strange glow, but this time, everyone in the car was silent. The atmosphere became so uncomfortable that it was as if everyone was seeing the same thing as me, but no one had the courage to say anything. Another thing I noticed was the way he blinked. Yes, the act of blinking. It was different. I know it sounds crazy, but listen, Mark rarely blinked like an average person. When he did this, it was incredibly slow, as if the movement was controlled, almost mechanical. And sometimes I felt like he was blinking with a second eyelid. I'm not saying he literally had two visible eyelids, but the way his eyes moved, it looked like there was something hidden there, something he was trying to hide. There was even a scary moment on a night trip. We were driving to a property in a remote location, and I had to stop the car because there was something in the road. I turned back to warn Mark, and at that moment, he looked straight at me. I swear his eyes didn't look human. For a second, it was as if I was looking into the eyes of a predator, cold, calculating, almost mesmerizing. My heart raced, and I felt something was terribly wrong. He must have noticed my discomfort because he quickly looked away and went back to his tablet as if nothing had happened. After this episode, I started paying even more attention. These behaviors were not normal. They weren't something I could just ignore or attribute to external factors. It was as if, in moments when he was distracted or in stressful situations, the disguise, whatever it was, failed for a few seconds. And the truth, or part of it, was revealed. Another aspect that made me extremely uncomfortable was the way Mark Zuckerberg dealt with food. Working so closely with him, I was often present when he ate quick meals between meetings or on trips. What started out as something I considered just a billionaire's eccentricity ended up becoming yet another disturbing element about him. The first thing I noticed was that Mark almost never ate like a normal person. I'm not talking about healthy food choices or elaborate menus, but rather the fact that he often consumed food in ways that didn't make sense. For example, there were days when he asked for raw meat to be taken in a thermal container, but it wasn't to be prepared later. He ate it that way. One day, he opened one of these packages in the back seat of the car, took out a piece of red meat, almost dripping with blood, and began chewing it as if it was something completely normal. I was in shock. There was no seasoning, no preparation, only raw meat. When I casually asked his personal assistant about it, he just shrugged and said, "Mark likes natural foods, no interference." But come on, who eats raw meat on a regular basis without consequences? There was another occasion, during a trip to an event outside of San Francisco, when he brought some kind of smoothie. but the smell was unbearable, almost like rotten fish mixed with dirt. I don't know what was in it, but it was so intense that I had to open the car windows, even with the air conditioning on. He noticed and asked, with that robotic tone he has, "Is the smell bothering you, Jack?" I was paralyzed because I didn't know how to respond. I just said everything was fine and continued driving, but that drink didn't look like anything a human would consume. Another detail that never left my mind was the fact that he practically doesn't consume water. Have you ever noticed in interviews or public appearances that he is rarely seen with a bottle of water? Well, I also noticed this on a daily basis during all the time I worked with him. I can count on one hand the times I saw him drink water. Instead, he had small, strangely colored capsules, something between green and silver, that he took as if they were vitamins. When I asked another team member what it was, he just told me, "Something only Mark takes. Don't ask about it anymore." One of the strangest moments happened during an international trip to Asia. After a long meeting, he asked me to stop at a local market, but specified that I should find a store that sold reptiles or exotic products. I thought it was something related to a cultural or gastronomic interest, so I didn't question it. When we finally found a place like that, he went in alone and came out about 20 minutes later with a small container. Inside was something that looked like reptile flesh, scaly and raw. He took it with him to the hotel and insisted that no one else enter his room that night. All of this just made me realize that Mark's relationship with food wasn't just unusual, it was disturbing. It seemed like he wasn't eating to sustain a human body, but rather to sustain something different, something that perhaps needed more than ordinary nutrients. If there's one thing I'll never forget about working with Mark Zuckerberg, it's his obsession with keeping his car at a temperature that was almost unbearable for any normal person. From the first day, I was clearly instructed. The air conditioning must always be set to extremely low temperatures, somewhere between 15 and 16 degrees Celsius. At first, I thought it was just a matter of personal comfort. Some people actually prefer the cold, but over time I realized there was something much stranger behind it. There was the time our car's air conditioning system broke down while we were on our way to a meeting in Menlo Park. It was a hot day, but not unbearable, around 27 degrees Celsius. However, Mark began to show almost immediate discomfort. He was sweating in a way that didn't seem normal. But what caught my attention most was the texture of his skin. It felt like it was getting rougher. It was no ordinary sweat. It was as if the humidity highlighted some kind of pattern, almost like scales, that disappeared as soon as he wiped his face with a tissue. Mark insisted that I stop the car immediately, even though we were late for the appointment. As soon as we parked, he got out of the vehicle and asked to stay in the shade of a tree while his team organized another car to pick him up. I stayed in the car, but through the window, I watched him rubbing his neck and arms as if he was trying to relieve some irritation. It was at that moment that I realized something. He always wore clothes with long sleeves and high collars, even on hotter days. I never thought much about it until then, but it seemed like he was hiding something. Another episode that reinforced this idea happened during a night trip to an event in Nevada. It was winter, and the air outside was already freezing, but Mark asked me to turn up the air conditioning even more. I was shivering in the front seat, even with my heavy coat, but he felt completely comfortable, almost refreshed. When I commented that the temperature was very low, he responded calmly, with that almost robotic tone of his. That's how I work best. Do I work? Who uses this word to describe thermal comfort? There was also a situation during a gala event in New York. The car we used had the heating slightly on because it was snowing outside. As soon as Mark entered, he stood still for a few seconds, as if he was processing something. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Turn it off now." It wasn't a request. It was almost an order. I hung up immediately, but he kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, as if checking to see if I had actually complied. He remained silent for the rest of the journey, but the atmosphere in the car was tense, almost suffocating. Over time, I realized that he didn't just prefer cold temperatures, he needed them. It wasn't something optional. It seemed that without that icy environment, his body reacted in ways he couldn't completely control. I can't prove what this means, but adding this to all the other strange behaviors, I began to believe that the cold was a physiological need, not a whim. And that scares me to this day. Another unsettling aspect of my acquaintance with Mark Zuckerberg was the peculiar and sometimes frightening way in which he communicated. I'm not just talking about your famous robotic style of speaking in interviews or your calculated posture. I'm talking about sounds, words, and behaviors that I have never seen or heard in anyone else. The first time I noticed something out of the ordinary was on a call he made in the back seat of his car. I wasn't paying attention, but then I heard something that gave me goosebumps. He started speaking in a low tone, almost like a whisper, and used words that didn't sound like they were from any known language. At first, I thought it was some kind of coded language used for security, but the sound was so strange that it sounded more like a mix of pops, hisses, and something guttural, as if he was talking to someone who wasn't human. Once, while driving him to a meeting, he was on the phone with a high-ranking executive. He started to speak normally, but at a certain point, his voice changed. It became more serious, almost animalistic for a few seconds. The silence on the other end of the line was palpable, and after that, he ended the call abruptly without explanation. The strangest thing is that he didn't seem to realize what had happened. Another behavior that scared me was how he made strange sounds when he was distracted or in quiet moments in the car. It was something almost instinctive, a kind of click or click that he made with his tongue, as if it were its own language. At first I thought it was a nervous tic, but these sounds always came in patterns, as if he was communicating with something or someone I couldn't see. Once, as I waited outside an evening meeting for him, I heard what sounded like the same sounds coming from inside the building. They seemed to reverberate from a room far from the main entrance. It was a repetitive, low, almost hypnotizing noise. When he returned to the car, he was completely calm, as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere around him seemed charged. It was as if the environment had changed just by his presence. The scariest thing happened while traveling to an event in a remote location. We were in the car, and he was typing something on his laptop. Suddenly he began to murmur again in that low, almost reptilian tone. This time, it seemed like he didn't even realize he was doing it. Then, without warning, he stopped, looked directly at me in the rearview mirror and asked, "Did you hear something, Jack?" His voice was calm, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my blood run cold. I denied it, of course. I didn't have the courage to say I was listening to everything. These moments made me believe that Mark doesn't just communicate in ways that we humans understand. It felt like he had another layer of language, something not meant for our ears or understanding. And that, more than anything else, solidified my suspicion that he wasn't just an eccentric billionaire. There was something more, something he tried to hide, but it emerged in these unusual lapses of communication. One of the most unsettling aspects of Mark Zuckerberg was the way he moved. In everyday life, when you see him in videos or events, he just seems like a serious person, maybe a little rigid. But living so closely with him, I began to notice that his movements weren't just different, they were abnormal. Something about the way he controlled his body seemed not human. The first time I noticed something strange was during a long-distance trip. He was sitting in the back seat, typing on his laptop, when he suddenly stretched. But the movement was not natural. His arm extended at an angle that seemed impossible, as if the joint was more flexible than it should be. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, trying to understand what I had just seen, but he quickly returned to his normal position and continued working as if nothing had happened. Another moment that stood out to me was at an event where he had to get out of the car quickly. He came out with such agility that for a second it seemed as if he hadn't used his feet to propel himself. It was as if he had slid off the bench. It was so fluid that it looked like something choreographed, but it was impossible not to notice that the movement didn't correspond to what a normal human body would do. There was also a day when I took him to one of his more remote properties, a place where he apparently went to rest and think about strategy. While waiting in the car, he went for a little walk. It was then that I realized something deeply disturbing. His footsteps made no noise, even though he walked on dry leaves and broken branches. I know this seems impossible, but he walked in such a controlled way that it looked like he was floating, or that his feet barely touched the ground. Again, I tried to rationalize, but I couldn't. Another terrifying episode happened during a night when he was visibly stressed. He began moving around in the back seat quickly, almost frantically, as if he was trying to calm himself. His movements were abrupt and angularly perfect, almost mechanical. The strangest thing is that at a certain point, he turned his head to the side at an angle that seemed impossible, almost as if he had no bone limitations. I sat still in the front seat, pretending not to notice, but my heart was racing. It was the scariest thing I've ever witnessed. One detail that also caught my attention was how he rarely used facial expressions to communicate. When he spoke, his face remained almost still, and when he moved, it seemed as if each movement was calculated, as if he were measuring the impact of each gesture. But there were times when, if he thought no one was looking, his expression would change in a frightening, almost animalistic way. The muscles in his face seemed to contract involuntarily, as if there was something beneath the skin trying to adjust. These body movements, combined with the rest of the experiences, made me believe that Mark doesn't work like us humans. It seemed like sometimes his body struggled to adjust to something he was trying to hide, as if the mask he wears fails at certain times. And that, to me, was one of the scariest proofs that he may not be who or what we think he is. Another thing that always made me uncomfortable was the number of strange and honestly inexplicable objects that Mark Zuckerberg kept with him. Working so closely with him, it was not uncommon to have to carry his luggage or help organize items he needed for trips and meetings. And it was at these times that I began to realize that these objects were not common, and many of them did not make any sense. The first time I noticed something was on a trip to a country retreat. I was tasked with carrying a small black suitcase to the car, and as I lifted it, I realized it was incredibly heavy for its size. I was curious, but obviously I didn't open it. My job wasn't to question it. However, when we arrived at the location, Mark opened the suitcase in front of me without realizing that I was looking in the rearview mirror. Inside, there were stones that glowed with a phosphorescent green light, almost as if they were radioactive. They were smooth, perfectly round, and emitted a faint vibrating sound. He spent a few minutes holding one of them, staring at it as if meditating, before putting everything away again. Another item that caught my attention was a strange device he carried on international trips. It was something like a small metallic cylinder with lights flashing in patterns I had never seen before. He held the object in his hands while making those unusual sounds I mentioned earlier, the clicks and whispers that sounded like a language. It seemed like the device was responding because the lights flashed in sync with the sounds. It was a moment that left me cold. There was no one but us in the car, and he was interacting with it as if it was something alive. There was also an occasion when he asked me to keep a backpack in a special compartment in the car. When I went to move it, I smelled a strange smell coming from inside, something metallic and sour at the same time. Out of carelessness, I ended up opening the zipper slightly, and inside there was something that looked organic. It was difficult to tell exactly what it was, but it had the texture of fur or leather, with a pattern that resembled scales. I quickly closed it and never brought it up again. But the strangest of all the objects I saw was something he carried in a wooden box, locked with padlocks. During one trip, he carelessly left the box open, and when I looked, I saw something that looked like an ancient artifact, a kind of stone tablet with inscriptions that I didn't recognize. They looked like symbols or runes, but they weren't from any human language that I knew. The artifact seemed to almost pulse, as if it had an energy of its own. Mark seemed extremely protective of this box, as if it were the most important object he owned. It was these eccentric collections, coupled with the way he interacted with them, that left me increasingly convinced that he knew something we didn't. These items weren't just collector's items or accessories for an eccentric billionaire. They felt like tools, or maybe even objects of connection to something we didn't understand. And honestly, the more I saw, the more it became clear that Mark was keeping secrets that were beyond any human understanding. If there's one thing that convinced me once and for all that Mark Zuckerberg wasn't like the rest of us, it was his extremely unusual reaction to sunlight. At first, I thought he was just someone who avoided the sun because he preferred controlled environments. But over time, I realized there was something much stranger going on. One of the first times I noticed this was on a sunny morning in Palo Alto. I was waiting for him in the car, and as soon as he came out of the building and the sunlight touched his face, he immediately covered his eyes and looked away, as if the light was something unbearable. It wasn't just the discomfort of someone who forgot their sunglasses. It looked like he was in pain. He hurried to get into the car, and as soon as he closed the door, he asked for the windows to be tinted immediately. I thought it was just a bad day, but this behavior repeated itself whenever we were in situations with bright sunlight. Once, as we crossed an open area to get to an event, he asked the staff to set up an umbrella for him, even though it was only a few meters walk. I thought that was exaggerated, but what caught my attention the most was the reason. As he was walking, I noticed that his skin seemed to change texture under direct light. For a moment, it seemed like there was an almost translucent pattern on his skin, something that was only visible in the bright sunlight. There was also an episode during a trip to Southern California where the sun was particularly strong. The car's air conditioning was on full blast, but Mark still looked uncomfortable. He sat in the darkest corner of the back seat and put on a hood, covering as much skin as possible. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that he was adjusting something around his neck, as if he was worried about something that might be seen. It was there that I noticed that he avoided exposing his neck and arms to the sun as much as possible. Another incident I will never forget happened on an international trip to the Middle East. We were leaving an outdoor event, and Mark had insisted on an armored car with tinted windows waiting for him at the exit. However, there was a delay, and he was in sunlight for about 5 minutes. When he finally got into the car, he seemed agitated. He asked for a damp cloth and immediately began cleaning his face and hands, almost frantically. And then I saw it. The skin on the backs of my hands looked slightly green, as if there was something beneath the surface. He noticed me looking and immediately put his hands in his pockets without saying a word. The greatest proof of his problematic relationship with light came when one of his properties was being remodeled. He instructed the architectural team to install special glass that blocked almost all direct sunlight, even in areas where it seemed unnecessary. One of the assistants casually commented that Mark was hypersensitive to light, but did not elaborate. These reactions to sunlight, combined with everything I witnessed, were one of the decisive factors in believing that Mark was hiding something. It wasn't just a preference for shady environments. It seemed like his body didn't really tolerate the sun like ours did. It was as if the light revealed something he had been fighting to keep hidden.